How's it going, everyone? It's Mostrino here. If you just want to hear audio examples or get right into what this new technique is, I put timestamps in the description so you can skip to any section of the video that you want. Before I start though, I want to quickly give a huge thank you to you guys for the amazing response to my spectral stretching video. I wasn't expecting it to reach so many people, and I'm really glad that you guys enjoyed it. Seeing the reception to it was definitely a big part of my motivation to make this video, so I really hope that it can scratch that same itch for those of you who found my channel through the spectral stretching video. Now, before I get into this technique, I want to quickly explain what polyphonic retuning even is, as well as talk about some of the current tools that are out there for doing polyphonic retuning. So, if you're already familiar with polyphonic retuning, feel free to just skip to the next section. So, a sound is polyphonic when it has multiple notes playing at the same time. So when I talk about polyphonic retuning, I'm talking about repitching each of these multiple notes. More specifically though, I'm talking about repitching these notes independently. To see why this distinction is important, let me give you guys an example. So here I have a sample of a piano playing a G major chord. Now this sample is polyphonic since it has the notes G, B, and D all playing at the same time. Right now I can just pitch it up or down using the pitch knob in the sampler. This is repitching all of the notes in this polyphonic sample, but it's not the same as repitching the notes independently. Let's say I want to repitch this G major chord to instead be an A minor chord. If we take a look at what these chords look like in MIDI, we can see that one way to repitch this chord would be to pitch G up 2 semitones, pitch B up 1 semitone, and pitch D up 2 semitones. Well, let's try pitching the sample up 2 semitones and see what happens. By pitching the sample up 2 semitones, we've pitched all of the notes up 2 semitones, so we actually get an A major chord instead of the A minor chord that we want. Okay, well, one problem was that we only needed to pitch B up 1 semitone instead of 2, so what if we pitch the sample up 1 semitone? Well, now we've pitched all of the notes up 1 semitone, so we actually get a G sharp or A flat major chord, which also isn't the A minor chord that we want. It turns out that there's actually no way to turn this G major chord into an A minor chord just by repitching it in the sampler, which is why this pitch knob isn't doing polyphonic retuning. So hopefully this kind of helps to motivate why polyphonic retuning tools are so useful, since you're really limited in the ways that you can repitch polyphonic audio if you're just pitching everything up and down. Now, there are a lot of tools already out there for doing polyphonic retuning, but I'm mostly just going to focus on ones that let you do polyphonic retuning in real time. And at least from what I've seen, the most popular ones that I think are the most relevant for this video are Zynaptics Pitch Map and Pitch Map Colors, Z-Plane's Retune, and Zinth Audio's Chroma. These are all plugins that you can just bring into your effects chain, and I've got Pitch Map and Retune loaded up here so that I can give you guys an idea of how these plugins work. So let's start off with this example. Let's say we want to retune this G major chord to be an A minor chord like I was saying earlier. With Pitch Map, what we can do is we can add a MIDI out, and then we can put in as the notes this A minor chord that we want to retune the piano to. And then what we can do in Pitch Map is set the input port to match the output port of the MIDI out, so in this case 0. And then we turn on this MIDI map option here, and we can mess with the dials until we get a result that we like. And if I play an actual A minor chord for reference, you can hear that we did actually polyphonically retune this piano sample from G major to A minor. The same thing goes for retune. If I open this up here, we can go in and set the MIDI input port to 0, set the key to chromatic, and then mess with the settings until we get something we like. And again, we've polyphonically retuned this piano from G major to A minor. Another thing that these plugins can do that I want to point out is, let's say that we give it an input signal that's actually completely atonal to begin with, like noise. Now, if you haven't used these plugins before and you're not familiar with them, then you might expect it to not do anything. But it turns out that another thing these plugins can do, beyond just retuning polyphonic audio, is that it can actually also imprint tonality onto sounds that were previously atonal. So if I bring back this pitch map here, you can start to hear the chord in the noise, and if I turn up this purify knob, it becomes even more obvious. The same thing goes for retune. You can hear how we took this atonal noise and added this A minor tonality into it. Now, one question that you guys might be asking is, how? How can these plugins retune these notes independently when something like the pitch knob on the sampler just can't do it? Well, all of these plugins take their own approaches to doing this polyphonic retuning. I believe Chroma is based on NASCO's spectral scalar preset, which uses filtering to isolate the out-of-key frequencies and then just pitch shifts them up or down a semitone to bring them back in key. PitchMap has its own algorithm that identifies the harmonics and transients in the original signal so it can separate the different notes and repitch them independently. And Z-Plane used their own ToneArt V2 technology, which can determine both the pitches and key of the input signal. And just like PitchMap, Retune also separates the signal into the transient and tonal parts to process them separately and uses pitch shifting to retune the notes. By the way, I've put the links to all of the documentation and resources that I'm pulling this info from in the description in case you want to read more. Anyways, the approach that I'm about to show you is completely different, and I haven't seen anybody else doing it. It doesn't use any note detection, and it doesn't even use any pitch shifting. Instead, it uses this plugin, Frequency Magnet by Andrew Riemann. Now, for those of you who've seen my spectral stretching video, this is from the same suite as the spectral gate plugin I showed in that video, so it's completely free and open source. I've linked it in the description so you guys can download it if you haven't already. Now, before I get into how you can use Frequency Magnet to do polyphonic retuning, let me first talk about how the plugin even works. You can start by setting a center frequency here, and you can sort of think of this center frequency as the magnet that will pull and attract other frequencies to it. The width determines how big of a frequency neighborhood is going to be affected by the center frequency, and then the width bias is like the strength of the magnet. It affects how strongly frequencies are pulled into the center frequency. I'm going to give you guys a few examples that will hopefully elucidate what this plugin is actually doing. First, let me just start with noise. If I choose the center frequency here, I'll just keep it at the default G5. And I start to turn up the width bias. You can hear the other frequencies move towards that G5 800 Hertz frequency. Now, if I set the width to 0, all of the frequencies will move to it. And if I set the width to 1, basically no frequencies will move to G5 and it'll sound like the plugin isn't doing anything. So that should hopefully kind of give you an idea of what it's doing, which is that you select this frequency center and it pulls the other frequencies towards it. It might be even clearer if I just set the width bias up a little bit and then move the frequency center so you can hear how that affects the sound. You can hear that the frequencies are being attracted to a different note. But another thing that I want to take a look at is how exactly it's moving the frequencies. And for that, I think a better example would be to just have two sine waves here. So here I have two sine waves, one playing at 400 Hz and another playing at 1600 Hz. And I'm going to set the center of the frequency magnet to be somewhere in between them. Let's do about 900 Hz. And then I'm going to turn up the width bias so that you can hear how the frequencies are being affected by the plugin. And this also changes depending on the FFT size. And I believe that this plugin is just using frequency shifting, not pitch shifting, to move the audio towards the frequency center. Now, you might have heard that, and if you're familiar with frequency shifting, you might have thought that that doesn't really sound anything like frequency shifting because of how the notes were kind of reacting weirdly, and it wasn't like a completely smooth shift up or down. For example, if I just take the sine wave at 1600 Hz, and I apply something like the free kilohertz frequency shifter, you can hear that the tone is shifting much more smoothly. But this is actually doing a different type of frequency shifting than the one that I believe Frequency Magnet does. I believe Frequency Magnet does FFT-based frequency shifting. And if we want to get an idea of what that sounds like, we can use the FFT-based frequency shifter from the same spectral suite. And when we take a listen to this, to me, this sounds a lot more like the kind of movement that we were hearing with Frequency Magnet. So there you go. But how is this plugin going to let us do polyphonic retuning? Well, let's think about what we're trying to accomplish when we do polyphonic retuning. We have an input signal that consists of multiple notes, and we want to shift those notes to be a different desired pitch. For instance, let's think about the piano example from earlier. Here, we wanted to turn this G major chord into an A minor chord. So, what if we just use multiple frequency magnets with center frequencies at A, C, and E? Then, with the right width, maybe we can shift each of the notes of our original G major chord to be the notes in an A minor chord. Also, remember that another bonus of plugins like PitchMap and Retune is that they could also add tonality to atonal input signals. Well, as we saw, Frequency Magnet can do the same thing, like when it created a tonal peak with the noise input. So, not only can we use Frequency Magnet to retune polyphonic audio, but we might also be able to use it to add tonality to sounds that don't have it already. So I wanted to try this to see if it would actually work, but I did encounter a big problem when trying to set this up. As you guys can see, you can only set the frequency center in this plugin to be between 20 Hz and 2000 Hz. But any of you guys that are familiar with polyphonic retuning will know that you usually have to retune frequencies way above 2000 Hz to get a good result. If you don't know why, let me give you an example. Let me pull up a saw wave here and cut out everything below 2000 Hz. Now, if I play some notes here, you can still clearly tell that I'm playing different notes even without all the low frequencies. So, even if you retune all of the frequencies below 2000 Hz, the frequencies above 2000 Hz might still be noticeably out of tune. In fact, I have to bring this filter all the way up to 6,000 or 7,000 Hz for the frequencies to have a less discernible pitch. If you listen closely, you can still tell that I'm changing notes, but at least at this point, if you retune all of the other frequencies, this high end won't stick out as much and will sort of just be like noise. So I asked Andrew Riemann, who made the plugin, if he could consider increasing the maximum possible center frequency to fix this problem. Now, like I said, these plugins are free and open source, so we could have easily just been like, sorry, I don't really have time, but the plugin is open source, so you can just go and edit the code to increase it yourself. And I would have been stuck having to figure out enough about coding to decipher how the plugin worked and figure out how to change that maximum frequency. But instead, Andrew graciously agreed to update the plugin to raise the maximum frequency and even went as far as to send me separate versions so that I could start using it right away. So for that, I have to give a huge thank you to the legend Andrew Riemann because he really was crucial for making this possible. Not just in making Frequency Magnet in the first place, of course, but also for adjusting the maximum frequency so that we can get that sweet high-end retuning. So now, if you go into the settings panel, you can change the maximum frequency for the frequency center to be as high as 20 kilohertz. He just put this out in the most recent update to the Spectral Suite, so make sure you've got the latest version or otherwise this won't work. Anyways, with that no longer being a problem, I wanted to see if I could get this Frequency Magnet retuning idea to actually work. So I created this preset in Patcher. If you want to use this patch for yourself, I've linked it in the description so you guys can download it. I'm giving it to you guys completely for free, and it's just a Google Drive link, so you can download it right away and not have to deal with an annoying download gate or anything. Of course, the one big downside is that you have to have FL Studio to use it, since I made it in Patcher, but I'm going to go over exactly how I made it, so hopefully you guys can find a way to remake it in whatever DAW you're using. Now, if you are going to download this preset, I ask that you please watch the section of the video at this timestamp. You don't have to skip to it right now, but please make sure you watch it. Now, before I get into how I made this patch, let me go over how to set it up and what these knobs in the interface do so you guys can use it for yourselves. First, put Patcher on the mixer track of whatever sound you want to retune and open up the Pitch Magnet preset. Then, open up a MIDI out and put the notes that you want to retune the sound to. Then, go into here and set the MIDI out to port 0. That's the one I chose when making the preset, so you're going to want to have it set to port 0 for the patch to actually work. Now, as long as you have the MIDI and the sound playing at the same time, the patch should work. I'm going to go over the knobs in the interface and how I made this patch before giving you guys audio examples, so if you want to hear the audio examples first, feel free to skip ahead and come back to this section afterwards. But for now, let me go over this interface. So first, we've got this intensity knob. This is just linked to the width bias knob in the Frequency Magnet plugins, so the more you turn it up, the more the frequencies get shifted to the center frequency. It isn't really the same as a mix knob, so if you want to mix the effect with the dry signal, you should just use this knob instead. The FFT size is hopefully pretty self-explanatory, and I even added a little guide so you can see what each number corresponds with. Now, if you don't know that much about spectral processing and don't know what this FFT size even means, basically, the important thing to know is that low values for the FFT size give you more time accuracy, whereas high values for the FFT size give you more frequency accuracy. So, when you have the FFT size set to a low value and you try to do polyphonic retuning, you might notice that the notes sound a bit off and that they're not at the exact correct pitch. When you have the FFT size set to a higher value, the notes are a lot more accurate, but you might also notice a lot more smearing and pre-ringing, and higher FFT sizes also add a lot more latency to the plugin. Unfortunately, this kind of trade-off is just something that's inherent with FFT processing, so you're going to want to mess with the FFT size until you get the best middle ground for the sound that you're looking for. You can go much higher than 8K in the Frequency Magnet plugin. You can actually set the FFT size to be as much as over 1 million, but I figured that once you get to FFT sizes that high, the patch becomes basically unusable, so I just capped it at 8K. That said, you can still go into the patch and change it if you want to use an even higher FFT size than 8K. Now, these two knobs basically bypass the effect for the low and high frequencies so that you can just keep the low end or the high end of the original dry signal. These slope controls at the bottom here determine how steep the crossover filters are for these low and high frequency bypasses. A higher number means a steeper slope, and it goes all the way up to 8, which is 96 dB per octave, and down to 1, which is just 6 dB per octave. This slope control can be useful if you want to just hard bypass everything above like 4 kilohertz, for instance, or if you want to just gradually bring in the dry signal for the high or low frequencies so that the bypass is less noticeable. Also, I added these low and high frequency volume knobs in case you want to turn down the low or high end of the bypass signal or just take it out entirely. Now that I've gone over the interface, let's go under the hood and take a look at how I actually made this patch. So the main idea is that each note for each octave has its own frequency magnet. Here I'm just mapping the FFT size and width bias to the respective controls in the interface. The width is set to 0, and I'm manually controlling the width with these EQs. These EQs are all centered at the frequency of the respective notes, so these band passes basically make it so that only the frequencies close to each note get affected by that note's frequency magnet. You'll also notice that I have all of these EQs set to linear phase mode. I wanted to avoid having a bunch of phasing from using all of these EQs, and I figured that since we're doing FFT processing, we're already going to have a bunch of latency and pre-ringing anyway, so I figured that the added latency and ringing from the linear phase filters isn't that important. That said though, if the added latency and ringing is important to you, you can of course go in here and turn linear phase mode off. I do know that that would certainly be a huge headache to do since you have to do it for so many EQs, and so I wanted to have it all linked to just one switch that you can turn on and off in the interface. Unfortunately though, the linear phase mode for the EQ isn't automatable, so I can't link it to any controls. This actually surprised me because the linear phase mode for the frequency splitter is automatable, but it just isn't for the EQ. I did talk to one of the folks from ImageLine about this, but I don't know when or even if they'll add it, and I wanted to get this video out to you guys, so unfortunately having a linear phase switch just wasn't possible. Now going back to the rest of the patch, the one other third-party plugin I used is this plugin called Note Mapper. This plugin is also free, so make sure to install it before opening this patcher patch. I've linked it in the description so you guys can download it from there. Basically, the reason I'm using this plugin is so that the MIDI input can be octave independent. Notice how for pitch map and retune, like I showed in the examples earlier, it didn't matter what octave we put the MIDI in. If I wanted to retune the piano or the noise to be in A minor, it would retune the notes in every octave. And even here, just visually, you can see that it's affecting the notes in every octave. So I wanted pitch magnet to work the same way, since if you want to retune a note to C, for example, you'd usually want to have the note retuned to C in every octave. Now, in all fairness, you can have the MIDI input in pitch map be octave independent if you change the edit mode here to custom. And now you can see that it's only retuning this specific octave. So of course, if you want the MIDI input in pitch magnet to be octave independent, you can edit the patch to do that. The reason why I'm using Note Mapper specifically is because as far as I know, there isn't any way to make the MIDI input octave independent with just stock plugins. But if any of you guys do know a way to do it with stock plugins, please feel free to leave a comment letting me know. Now each of the note mappers correspond to different notes. So this one is C, this one is C sharp, etc. And what's happening here is, when you send the note C, for example, through the MIDI out, this note mapper will interpret it as C5 no matter what octave of C you pressed, and then it will send that C as MIDI information to this 3x oscillator. This doesn't have to be 3x oscillator, by the way. I just used it because I figured it would be the most CPU efficient stock plugin. Then this 3x oscillator outputs the C tone as audio and sends it as input to this Fruity Peak controller. Then the Fruity Peak controller outputs its peak value as data to control the volume of this Fruity Balance. The way I set it up here is that I put the bass to 0 and the volume to 80% so that when the 3x oscillator isn't playing, the peak controller is outputting a value of 0%, which makes the Fruity Balance mute the incoming audio. Then, when the 3x oscillator is playing, the peak controller outputs a value of 80%, which corresponds to just a 0 dB change in the Fruity Balance. So essentially, all that this 3x oscillator peak controller Fruity Balance combo is doing is it's acting as a note gate. When you don't play C, these EQs don't get any audio going into them, so these frequency magnets don't do anything, meaning that your audio isn't being retuned to C. When you do play C, the audio goes through, and the frequency magnets start retuning the audio to C. I might have overcomplicated the setup of these note gates, so if any of you guys know a simpler way to make a note gate with stock plugins or with Note Mapper, feel free to let me know in the comments. Now, since we're muting the signal when we don't play a note, this would mean that sending 2 notes through the MIDI out would be twice as loud as sending 1 note, for example. So, That's what all of these Fruity Formula controllers are for. They basically keep track of how many MIDI notes you're playing and turn down the volume with this automated gain so that the volume stays consistent no matter how many notes you send in the MIDI. These XYZ controllers are just to set up the knobs and link them to the right parameters. Like here, for example, you can see that I have the output mapping set for the FFT size so that the numbers correspond with the right values in the plugin. And of course, at the beginning, I've got this frequency splitter here for if you want to bypass the effect for the low or the high end. So that's how this patch is set up. The main idea, again, is to use a bunch of frequency magnets to retune the incoming audio to play the notes that you want. But of course, the big question is, does it actually sound any good? Well, let's see. So here I've got 4 different sounds that I'm going to use the patch on. And not only am I going to show you guys how the patch sounds, I'm going to apply the same processing to pitch map and retune so that you can see how it compares with some of the plugins that people currently use for polyphonic retuning. By the way, all of these sounds are from this free Exabolt 10 sample pack. So if any of you guys want to run these comparisons for yourself, you guys can download the pack and test it on the exact same sounds. For each of these sounds, I'm going to tweak the controls in the pitch magnet interface to try and get the result that I think sounds the best, but I'm not going to touch anything else in the patch besides that. All right, so to start, we have this sort of laser sound that's playing an A sharp minor chord. And let's say we want to retune this to be a D sharp major chord. Well, with pitch map, that would sound like this. With retune, it would sound like this. And then here's how it sounds like with pitch magnet. Next, we've got this bass sample. And this is more of an example where the input sound doesn't have a whole lot of tonality and we want to add tonality to it. So let's say we want this growl to play a B minor chord. Well, with pitch map, it would sound like this. With retune, it sounds like this. And then pitch magnet. Next, another bass. And this one I wanted to give an example of what if we don't do a triad, for instance, with this A sharp 6 chord. Well, in this case, with pitch map, it sounds like this. Retune. And then pitch magnet. And then the final example that I want to give you is what if we don't even do chords at all? What if we just have it like moving in different notes for the MIDI? So in this case, I've got this glitch sample. And with pitch map, it'll sound like this. With retune, it'll sound like this. And then with pitch magnet, it'll sound like this. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of the kind of sounds you can get using pitch magnet. Obviously, it's not identical to pitch map or retune, but pitch map and retune aren't even identical to each other. So all things considered, I'd say it's a success because it's a completely different approach to polyphonic retuning that still gets the job done. That said, since it's such a different approach, it does come with its own set of advantages and drawbacks, so let's talk about those now. The first advantage I'd bring up with this method is that it's free. All of the plugins I mentioned earlier, like pitch map, retune, chroma, etc., are all paid, and some of them are quite expensive. In this case, though, not only is the patcher patch free, but also all of the plugins I'm using like Frequency Magnet and Note Mapper are free. So if you want to set up this method differently, you can still do it without having to pay for any plugins. That said, there might be other free polyphonic retuning plugins out there that I just don't know about, so this advantage isn't really inherent to the method itself, but I figured that it was worth mentioning. One advantage that is inherent to this method, though, is that it can give you a different flavor of polyphonic retuning. In these examples, I was just trying to make it sound similar to pitch map and retune. But even then, it already sounds different, and if I change some parameters like the FFT size, maybe have it affect more of the high end, I can easily get a noticeably different sounding result with pitch magnet. And now this sounds completely different, even if you turn the purify way up on pitch map. You still get a different sounding result. So, even if you do own some of the plugins I mentioned earlier, this method might still be useful if you want to diversify the kind of sounds you get with polyphonic retuning. Now, one con is that it doesn't really preserve transients. For instance, in the first example here with the laser, you can definitely notice between pitch map and retune and pitch magnet, you can definitely notice that pitch magnet introduces this pre-ringing that the other plugins don't introduce. Now, this is partially because I have the FFT size so high, but if I turn the FFT size down, while you do get less pre-ringing, it doesn't do as good of a job of actually retuning the notes like I was mentioning earlier. So part of the reason why it doesn't really preserve transients is because of the fact that we're using FFT processing, so you're going to get some pre-ringing. But another reason was what I was mentioning earlier with pitch map and retune about how they split the signal into the transient and tonal parts. Pitch magnet doesn't do that, though even if you do split it into transient and tonal parts beforehand, you might still notice some smearing just because of the FFT processing and the pre-ringing that I was just talking about. So, if you're using this on transient heavy sounds and want to preserve the transients, you might have to get a bit creative with your processing, like bouncing out the retuned signal and maybe replacing the transients with the transients from the dry signal. Another con is that you can't really remap specific notes like you can with retune and pitch map. This is a fundamental difference between this method and plugins like retune and pitch map, because those plugins detect the pitches of the incoming signal, whereas this patch doesn't do any pitch detection. So in those plugins, if you want to retune C to be D, for example, you can do so right here in the interface. You can just drag it up here in pitch map, and in retune, you can take the input C and map it to be D. But that's not really possible with pitch magnet. You could try to work around this. For example, you could go into the C's here and change the band passes to be really tight so that it only takes the parts of the input signal that play C. And then you could change the frequency centers of these frequency magnets to be D so that you repitch all of the C's in the original signal to be D. But it's definitely not as streamlined as in these plugins, and I feel like it's not really this method's strong suit anyway. But this comes with another implication. So far in this video, I've been using the MIDI input on pitch map and retune to take incoming audio and retune it to play certain chords or notes. But another common usage of these plugins is to change the key of polyphonic audio rather than forcing the audio to play specific notes. Let me give you guys an example. So here I have this melody. This is from the same Exabolt 10 sample pack that I've been using all the other examples from so far for this video. And this melody is in C minor, and it sounds like this. And let's say that we want to change this melody to instead be in C major. Now, in pitch map and retune, you can change the key right here from the interface, but I'm just going to send these plugins the MIDI notes of the entire C major scale, which is going to do the same thing. So if we use pitch map to retune it, the melody goes from sounding like this to this. And if we use retune to repitch it, the melody will sound like this. So you basically get the same results as with pitch map. Since it's detecting the incoming pitches, it can take the notes that are outside of C major and repitch them to be in C major. But look at what happens if we try to do the same thing with pitch magnet. In this case, it sounds like this. Instead of retuning the sample so that it only plays notes in C major, we're retuning the sample so that it plays every note in C major. This is because with pitch magnet, it shifts all of the frequencies near C to be at C, it shifts all of the frequencies near D to be at D, etc. So the result that you get is that the audio plays every MIDI note you send it. The only way pitch magnet won't force the audio to play one of the MIDI notes you send it is if there are just no frequencies near that note in the audio at all. But for this sample, and for most sounds, there are going to be frequencies near every note. So while pitch map and retune can actually distinguish whether those frequencies are playing notes or not and repitch them accordingly, pitch magnet is just going to retune those frequencies no matter what. While all of these pros and cons are definitely noteworthy, I do have one major pro and one major con that I want to go over. Let's start with the major pro. Since this is a completely different approach to polyphonic retuning, this approach lets you do something that's impossible to do with plugins like PitchMap, Retune, and Chroma, which is that you can retune notes to be in any frequency. If we go back to Frequency Magnet here, you can see that I can choose this center frequency to be anything I want. And again, I can change the frequency maximum so that I can go as high as 20,000 hertz. But notice that I can choose any frequency here that I want. I only chose the notes I did for pitch magnet because that's what we're familiar with, and that's what we've been using polyphonic retuning for so far. But nothing is stopping you from changing these frequencies to instead be in just intonation, or in 7-tone equal temperament, or in the Boland-Pierce scale, or in whatever scale you want. Granted, if you're using a scale that has something other than 12 notes, you'll have to add or delete frequency magnets and EQs from the patch to get it to work, and you'll have to decide which MIDI notes you want to associate with each note of the new scale, but you can totally do it. And this is something that, at least to my knowledge, was impossible before now. In PitchMap, the most you could do was change the input and output tuning, and in Retune, you could pitch each note up or down by up to 50 cents. But this was as much as you could do. Now you can finally make your 13-tone equal temperament color-based dreams come true. I think it's very exciting stuff, but I do need to get to the major con. And if you're just skipping here from earlier in the video, here's what I want you to know. The last con I want to mention with Pitch Magnet is that it's basically unusable. And by that, I specifically mean because of the CPU usage. Now, you might be confused because so far in the video, I've been using Pitch Magnet just fine without really any CPU glitches, and this is with me recording my screen at the same time. But the truth is that the only reason I'm not having CPU problems is because I'm using a very powerful computer. Let me give you guys a reference point, especially if you've used PitchMap before. For me, if I have everything off right now, you can see that my CPU load meter is at 1. If I go ahead and turn on PitchMap, you'll see that it uses about 3% of my CPU load. For most people, and on my old computer, it used a lot more. But at any rate, let's just compare it to Pitch Magnet. For me, Pitch Magnet uses over 30% of my CPU load, so maybe 10 times as much as PitchMap. And this is on an otherwise almost empty project. On my old computer, Pitch Magnet wouldn't even play properly. If you're using a less powerful computer, there's a chance that FL might just straight up crash if you try to open this patch. And even if it does open, it probably won't play properly. Even for me, if I open up Pitch Magnet in a busy project file, it might not play properly. Now, of course, you can still render it out and just work with the audio, and you'll probably want to do that either way because of the latency, so thankfully it's not completely unusable, but it's still a massive headache not being able to hear what you're doing when you change these knobs and having to keep guessing the best values and bouncing it out each time until you finally get a result you're happy with. Now, while some of you guys might have been surprised when I said that this patch is so CPU heavy, some of you other guys watching this might have looked at how many plugins I have in this patch and been like, well, of course it's unusable. But in my defense, this patch is significantly more CPU intensive than it should be. Let me explain. Let's say I want to retune a sound to a C major chord. Well, I'd put the notes C, E, and G for the C major chord. FL Studio then sends that MIDI information to the note mappers. The note mappers associated with C, E, and G then send the notes as MIDI to their respective 3x oscillators. The note mappers associated with every other note don't send any MIDI to the 3x oscillators. So, those 3x oscillators don't have any output, meaning that their peak controllers read a value of 0, so the signal there gets muted by the fruity balances. For the notes C, E, and G though, the 3x oscillator does output sound that the peak controller reads. So the signal passes unmuted by the Fruity balances and goes into these EQs. These EQs then go into these frequency magnets, which retune the signal to the notes C, E, and G. We then send that signal back to FL, which goes into our speakers. Notice that throughout this whole process, these plugins did nothing. The signal was muted before it even reached them, so they don't affect the output at all. The problem, though, is that even though these plugins didn't do anything, they're still using up CPU. This is especially bad because if we take a look at the performance in Patcher, you'll see that the frequency magnets are actually the most CPU intensive of all of the plugins that we're using in this patch. So, even though we only needed 24 frequency magnets, we're still paying for the CPU usage of 96 frequency magnets, meaning that we're basically using quadruple the CPU since the CPU usage of these formula controllers and Fruity balances is more or less negligible. Unfortunately, I just don't know of any way to have Patcher disable these plugins when they don't have any sound going into them. If any of you guys do know a way, please let me know because it would seriously make a massive difference in the CPU usage of this patch. Don't get me wrong, it would still be extremely CPU intensive and probably still unusable on lower end computers, and it would also mean that the more concurrent notes you send through the MIDI, the more CPU intensive the plugin would become. But either way, it would still significantly decrease the CPU load and make a big difference in a lot of cases. But again, I don't know of a way to do it if it's even possible. Besides that, I can't really think of many other ways to make the patch more efficient, unfortunately. In some cases, you might not necessarily need to retune these low or high octaves, so in those instances, you can delete them and it will help reduce the CPU a bit, but it'll still be really CPU heavy. It also might be possible to simplify my note gate setup with the 3x oscillators and the peak controllers, but even then, they don't use much CPU in the grand scheme of things. I also thought about just trying to make the effect in something like plug data to see if there's a more efficient way to do it if you just build it from scratch, but I quickly realized that I don't understand the ins and outs of plug data or frequency magnet well enough to pull that off, and again, I wanted to get this video out to you guys, so I didn't want to spend too much time trying to figure it out. Now, one thing I should mention is that these frequency centers don't actually need to be static. If we pull up frequency magnet here, the plugin can actually take MIDI input. So I can set the input port to port 0, and as I start playing notes here, you'll see that the frequency magnet center is reacting dynamically. The thing is though, the MIDI input is monophonic, since each instance of frequency magnet can only have one frequency center at a time. So if I play a chord, it's just going to pick one of the notes that I played. But in some specific cases, you might be able to use much fewer frequency magnets and have the frequency centers dynamically respond to your MIDI input. However, I couldn't think of a foolproof way to implement this in general. For one, maybe for some reason you want to have pitch magnet retune a sound to every single note at the same time, in which case you would need all 96 of these frequency magnets. But let's say you even knew ahead of time that you were never going to do something more complex than triads, so you'd never be playing more than 3 notes at the same time. Well, how could you split your polyphonic MIDI input into multiple monophonic MIDI inputs in a foolproof way? Well, there are 12 notes in each octave, so I think the natural idea would be to split the MIDI in groups of 4 and assign each group to a frequency magnet so you'd only have 24 frequency magnets instead of 96. So let's say you decided to split it so that A sharp, B, and C is one group, C sharp, D sharp, and E is another group, and F sharp, G, and G sharp is the third group. Well then, as soon as you do something as simple as a C sharp minor triad, you are suddenly sending these two notes, C sharp and E, to the same frequency magnet. Since the frequency magnet's MIDI input is monophonic, it'll only pick one of those two notes to be the frequency center, so it won't retune your sound to all of the notes that you want. So then what if you decide to split the MIDI notes in groups of 3 instead of 4 and have 36 frequency magnets? Let's say you split it so that A sharp, and B is the first group, C sharp, and D is the second group, D sharp, E, and F is the third group, and F sharp, G, and G sharp is the fourth group. And we're still assuming in this situation that you already know ahead of time that you're not going to play more than 3 notes at the same time. Well, even in this case, if you want to just play a C sus2 chord, for example, you're going to be sending these C and D notes to the same frequency magnet. So I think there are just too many cases you'd have to watch out for if you wanted to have the MIDI input control the frequency magnets directly, and you'd really need to be cognizant of the kinds of chords and MIDI inputs you'd be using to be able to make the frequency centers dynamic in a way that would always work for what you need. So unfortunately, I kind of have to leave you guys with this disappointing news, and this patch ends up just being more of a proof of concept rather than something that would actually be usable by a lot of people. Hopefully those of you with powerful computers can still enjoy this patch, and I really hope that we can find a more efficient way to implement this method so that everyone can enjoy it without any problems. But I didn't stop here. I wanted to see what other ways I could push this new method beyond what we can already do with polyphonic retuning. One of the advantages I mentioned earlier is that we can retune the notes to any frequency. I mentioned other scales and tuning systems earlier, but what if we just abandon scales altogether and go completely atonal by retuning our audio to random frequencies? And more than that, what if we keep randomizing the frequencies we're retuning to get some crazy rhythmic result? Well, to find out, I made this other patch here that I call Frequency Scrambler. Just like Pitch Magnet, you guys can download this for free from the same Google Drive link in the description. The interface is pretty similar to Pitch Magnet, and most of the stuff here is just doing the same thing as it does in Pitch Magnet. Like the FFT size is just the same thing. The intensity, again, just controls the width bias, and the high frequency cutoff and volume and slope are all the same. Really, the only new things here in the interface are these 3 knobs. That said though, the patch itself is set up completely differently than Pitch Magnet. Since the frequency centers are randomly determined, it doesn't take any MIDI input. Also, since I'm sure some of you guys are wondering, it is a lot less CPU intensive than Pitch Magnet. For me, it's using around 15% of my CPU load in FL, which is still a ton considering PitchMap only uses 3% of my CPU, but the good thing about Frequency Scrambler is that you can easily edit it to use less CPU if you need it to, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit. But for now, I want to explain exactly what this patch does and then go over how I made it. Essentially, if you have this scramble knob all the way down, the patch will dynamically set the frequency centers of the frequency magnets to match the pitches of the input signal. So, unlike Pitch Magnet, this patch actually does do pitch tracking. Then, when you turn the scramble knob up, the patch introduces randomness to the frequency centers. These scramble rate and smoothing knobs affect different parameters for that randomness. Now, let's go over how I made the patch. To start, I'm basically splitting the input signal into 16 different bands that each go into their own frequency magnets. Now here's what I was alluding to earlier when I said that you can make this patch use less CPU if you need it to. The choice to use 16 frequency magnets here was completely arbitrary. It basically just means that you're going to get 16 random peaks when you use this effect. If you find that the patch is too CPU intensive, here's what you can do. First, you can delete these groups of EQ2, Snap Heap, the controllers, and frequency magnet for as many of these frequency magnets as you need. Then, just readjust the frequencies and width of the remaining EQs so that they collectively cover the frequency spectrum from 0 Hz to 8 kHz. That way, you're just splitting the signal into say 10 bands instead of the original 16 bands, and the result will be the same except you'll only have 10 random peaks instead of 16. The good thing about this is that since it's just going to end up being atonal, it doesn't really make that big of a difference if you have more or fewer frequency magnets. For Pitch Magnet, on the other hand, you need a frequency magnet for each note, so deleting frequency magnets does make a big difference since you won't be able to retune to those notes anymore. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this patch is a lot more flexible to your CPU needs since there's no requirement for how many frequency magnets you need for this to work. Also, just like in Pitch Magnet, I've set all of these EQs to linear phase mode, so if you'd prefer not to have them in linear phase mode, you can of course edit the patch and disable it for all of the EQs. The good thing about this patch compared to Pitch Magnet is that it should hopefully be much less of a headache to disable linear phase mode for everything since I'm only using 17 EQs. Anyways, after the signal goes through the EQ, it then gets sent into this snap heap. But the thing is, it's actually being sent to the snap heap as the aux source rather than the main input. The main input is this Edison that's playing a looping sample of white noise. By the way, the reason you can get Edison to actually play by itself in Patcher is because the play pause button is actually a parameter that you can control in Patcher. So that's what this Fruity Formula controller is for. It's just sending a value of 1 to make sure that Edison is always playing. I don't know about you guys, but I actually didn't know that this was possible until not too long ago when I was making another patch with Baldy. So big shout out to Baldy for helping to discover this. But anyways, you might be wondering why I even have white noise playing in this patch at all. Like, what does that have to do with what we're trying to accomplish here? Well, let me open up this snap heap and explain exactly what I'm doing here. So like I said, the original signal that we're sending into Patcher and filtering through the EQ is being sent as the external aux source for the snap heap. The main input is the looping white noise that I just showed you. The reason I'm going through all this trouble is because I want to use Snap Heap's pitch tracking modulator to control the frequency center parameter for the frequency magnet so that the frequency centers can follow the pitch of the input signal. But the problem is that Snap Heap can only output audio. There's no way to make it just output the values of the pitch tracker. So I had to come up with a workaround. Basically, I'm using the pitch tracker on the aux source, so it's tracking the pitch of our original EQ'd signal like we'd want it to. But I need to find a way to actually get the pitch information out of the pitch tracker. So I'm using it to modulate the gain of the white noise that I'm sending into it. The input doesn't need to specifically be white noise, but it does need to be something with a constant amplitude. Then I'm taking the output of the snap heap and using it as the input for this peak controller. This peak controller then takes the amplitude of the incoming signal and turns it into numerical values that I can use to control the parameters of any plugin. So essentially what I've done is I've taken Snap Heap's pitch tracker values, turned them into amplitude changes in the form of audio, and then used the peak controller to turn those amplitudes back into values. Then as values, I can use them to control the center of the frequency magnet. There is one problem though. Remember that we want the center of the frequency magnet to correspond with the pitch of the input signal. So if the input audio plays A, for example, we want the frequency magnet to be centered at A. But the pitch tracker follows pitch, not frequency. This is a problem because pitch is logarithmic while frequency is linear. If you're not already familiar with this difference, I did touch on it in my spectral stretching video last year, but there are also plenty of other videos and resources that explain it if you prefer to learn elsewhere. Anyways, to fix this, I needed to make the output of the pitch tracker linear instead of logarithmic. So, before modulating the gain of the white noise, I put the pitch tracker through this remap modulator. The remap is set to an exponential curve, so you can think of it as applying the exponential function to the pitch tracker's logarithmic values. Since the exponential function and the logarithmic function are inverses of each other, applying one to the other will leave you with a linear function, which is exactly what we need. And by the way, this isn't just some arbitrary exponential curve. I made it specifically for this purpose and tested it on every note to make sure that the frequency centers in the frequency magnet actually did line up with the pitches of the input signal. That said, it doesn't work perfectly, and that's for a few reasons. First, Snap Heap's pitch tracker is only made to handle monophonic inputs, so if you have multiple notes in the same frequency band, the pitch tracker is going to have some problems. Also, there's the flip side where you don't have any notes in a certain frequency band, whether it be because the input signal is atonal, or because the notes are in a different frequency band, or maybe the input signal just doesn't have any information in those frequencies. So in these cases, the pitch tracker is just going to choose some random frequency even though there isn't a note being played at all. Also, I've noticed that once you get to low enough or high enough notes, the pitch tracker just kind of gives up and doesn't even pick up on the note that you're playing, so that can cause problems too. Aside from that though, the pitch tracking works fine, and I'll give you guys examples of where it works and where it doesn't really work so you have an idea of what to expect. That said though, if you're only interested in the actual frequency scrambling, then whether or not the pitch tracking works won't really matter. So on that note, let me go over how I'm doing the actual frequency scrambling and adding randomness to the frequency centers. Going back to this peak controller from earlier, you probably noticed that I have this LFO enabled. I've set the shape to be random, and what I'm doing is I'm using this Fruity Formula controller to determine how much the LFO should affect the value of the frequency center. So, when the scramble knob is at 0, the LFO doesn't have any effect on the frequency center, and the center is completely determined by the peak, which again is following the pitch of the input signal. When the scramble knob is at the max value, the LFO is affecting the frequency center at full depth. Here you can see now the frequency is randomly changing. And the scramble rate knob controls the rate of the random LFO, so if I turn it up, you can see now it's changing more rapidly. Another thing you'll notice is that this LFO is stepped, meaning that each time it changes values, the change is instant. If you don't want it to jump between values and instead smoothly transition between them, you can use the smoothing knob in the interface. The way I'm doing this is I'm linking each of these LFOs to a Fruity XYZ controller, and then the smoothing knob just controls the speed parameters in the XYZ controller, which makes it so that the change in values is more gradual. The one other thing I should mention is that the random LFO in the Fruity Peak controller is deterministic, meaning that each time you play it, you're going to get the same result. You can see this if I just go into here and just loop this section. As you can see, it's just looping the same shape in the random LFO. It is even clearer if I just loop a smaller section. You're getting the same movements in the random LFO every time. Now, I made the phase of every instance of the peak controller different so that the LFOs aren't all doing the same thing at the same time. But either way, each time you replay a section, you're going to hear the same thing. Now, this can be a good thing or a bad thing. It can be good in the sense that if the LFOs were just completely different every time and you got a sound you really liked but weren't recording it, it would just be lost forever pretty much. With this, at least if you get a sound you like, you'll get it consistently. Of course though, the downside is that if you're the type of person that likes to keep replaying a sound and get a different result every time, that won't work with these LFOs. Now the way the LFOs are deterministic is that they're based on the position of the playhead, so if you want to mess around with getting random sounds, all you have to do is just move the position of the sound in the playlist and the LFOs will all be different. For instance, when I play it here, and I keep replaying it, it's the same thing, but when I go over here, each time it's something different. Now that I've gone over the patch, let's take a listen to some audio examples. So here I've got 4 different examples. These last 3 are from the same pack I've been using for the whole video, but this first one is actually a cymatic sample because I wanted to give you guys an example with this vocal just so that you can kind of hear how the patch follows the pitch of the input signal. So for reference, this is how the vocal sounds like originally.
Living in a crowded dream, searching for the quiet that you need to breathe. Gave up on your sanity to hide behind your shadow.
And if I turn on Frequency Scrambler and start turning up the intensity knob, again with the scramble knob at 0, take a listen to what happens.
Living in a crowded dream, searching for the quiet that you need to breathe. Gave up on your sanity to hide behind your shadow.
You can hear that some of the higher band frequency magnets are kind of confused at what the input signal is doing, but as far as like those low fundamental notes go, the frequency magnet is following them without any issue.
Living in a crowded dream, searching for the quiet that you need to breathe. Gave up on your sanity to hide behind your shadow.
So even without turning the scramble on, this could already be a cool effect just messing with the intensity knob here.
Living in a crowded dream, searching for the quiet that you need to breathe. Gave up on your sanity to hide behind your shadow.
And maybe some of you guys are thinking that that kind of sounds like a format shifter. And that's actually a neat thing that I found with Frequency Magnet, which is that depending on the parameters you give it, it can even act as a format shifter, and you're kind of hearing a little bit of that here. Now, you'll also notice if I turn up the FFT size, we get more smearing, but also the frequencies are more precise. Or you can get a really tight sound, but with very imprecise frequencies.
Living in a crowded dream, searching for the quiet that you need to breathe.
And then here it sounds more like a filter than anything.
Living in a crowded dream, searching for the quiet that you need to breathe. Give up on your sanity to hide behind your shadow.
And again, here you can use the high frequency volume and cutoff and slope parameters to bring back the high end.
Living in a crowded dream, searching for the quiet that you need to breathe. Give up on your sanity to hide behind your shadow.
But now let's get into the exciting stuff. Let's start scrambling. So as I turn up the scramble knob, take a listen to what happens.
Living in a crowded dream, searching for the quiet that you need to breathe. Give up on your sanity to hide behind your shadow.
And then if you don't want it to be stepped, you can turn up the smoothing knob. And you can get some really weird sounds out of it. But really, I just wanted to use the vocal as the example for the pitch tracking. I do think that the actual scrambling, you'll get cooler results with some of these other sounds, so I will go into those now. Here, you'll hear as I play the sample that you do have a bit of like reverb that kind of blurs the pitches. But even in this instance, I think Frequency Scrambler still does a good job of following the pitches when you have the scramble turned to 0. And you do kind of get some weirdness when you turn the intensity up, like in these midpoints here, because as you saw when I was demonstrating frequency magnet by itself, you kind of have to really crank the width bias up for you to actually start hearing those tonal peaks. But once you have this intensity knob high enough, you can hear that, at least for those main notes, the frequency magnet is able to follow the pitches without any problem. And then now we can start scrambling. But now let's get into an example where the pitch tracking won't work anymore, even though we still have a melodic sample. So if I go ahead and play this pad, there's definitely notes being played, but it's a polyphonic sample. The notes kind of get blurred together, and you'll hear that as I turn this intensity knob up, Frequency Scrambler might be able to detect some of the notes, but it's not really going to be pitch tracking as effectively as it did for the first two examples. And you can especially hear with this low frequency kind of jumping around, it's like that snap heap pitch tracker not really being able to figure out what's happening, and it's jumping between different frequencies. But I think especially with a really sustained sound like this, you can get some really cool results and introduce a lot of rhythmic elements into it with the scramble knob here. And another thing that I want to mention is that if you turn the scramble rate all the way down, you can actually have the randomness be static. So if you don't want it to be constantly moving, you can just turn the scramble knob up and have a fixed random variation. So you could even just automate this knob and get some cool sound design effects. But for now, let's turn the scramble rate back up and hear how we can get some cool rhythmic sound design with this. And as I turn the FFT size up, you get even more of like a computer digital texture out of it. Or I can turn the FFT size way down and you get kind of like a cool moving filter effect. So this can be a great way to completely transform pads like this from something that's like really nice and smooth to like a moving rhythmic element. And here with the FFT size all the way down, you still get the tonality of the original pad. When you turn it all the way up, it goes completely atonal, but here you get like a moving pad that still has the tonality of the original. And again, you can mess with turning the smoothing up. Same thing for with a higher FFT size. And hopefully you can hear how you can really easily get crazy sounds out of this that sound nothing like the original input source. And then for this final example, I just have a bass sound, just to kind of give you an example of when you have like a more atonal sound like this. For one, the pitch tracking is not going to do anything for you. It kind of gets the sub, but beyond that, you're kind of out of luck. But then again, with these sounds, I feel like the most fun thing to do is just scramble them. And again, I'm just screwing around with some of the options on here. There are a bunch of other ways you can mess with these parameters and get completely different results. There are a bunch of other types of input sounds you can throw in here, but hopefully this already gives you an idea of the really cool sound design potential, where even though this idea kind of stemmed from wanting to do polyphonic retuning, now we've kind of taken that idea and used this completely different approach in a way that lets us do some cool kind of sound design that we wouldn't have been able to get to if we were just using the other polyphonic retuning tools that we've been using already. Now, one thing that I didn't mention when I was going over the Frequency Scrambler is that, as you guys saw, I am using another third-party plugin, which is Kilohertz Snap Heap. Now, unlike the other third-party plugins I've used so far in this video, Snap Heap is not actually free. It used to be free, but a couple years ago, Kilohertz changed their pricing model, and now it's $29. Now, in my opinion, this plugin is absolutely worth the money, and I've linked it in the description in case any of you guys do want to get it. But I could totally understand if any of you can't get it or just aren't interested, especially since it's playing such a minor role in this patch. So, I made a second version of this patch that doesn't use Snap Heap so that everyone can use it 100% for free. Now, of course, in the original patch, Snap Heap was responsible for making the frequency magnets follow the pitch of the input signal. I don't really know of a free plugin that can do the same thing, though if any of you guys know of one, feel free to let me know in the comments. But at least for now, I just made it so that all of the frequency centers have a fixed default position. So, when you have the scramble knob all the way down and you turn up the intensity, it'll sound like this. It'll always just retune to those frequencies by default. But as soon as you turn the scramble knob up, everything else will work the same as it does in the original Frequency Scrambler. Again, I've included this in that same Google Drive link in the description. The last thing I'll mention for the Frequency Scrambler is that there is another plugin in Andrew Riemann's spectral suite called Bin Scrambler that does a similar thing, but instead of randomizing the centers of frequency magnets like our patch does, Bin Scrambler randomizes the locations of the FFT bins. For comparison, Bin Scrambler sounds like this. Since the two take such different approaches, they tend to give you really different results from one another, but I wanted to throw this plugin out there as another way for you guys to mangle your sounds. Alright, now that is actually everything that I wanted to say for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you found this video valuable, and I'm so excited to see how you guys implement these ideas and techniques in your own projects. If you want to talk more with me, please feel free to join my Discord server. I've linked it in the description. That's all from me. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.